540 cubic inch big block? Check. Modern low profile roots blower? Check. Instant horsepower on tap? Oh, check. As you've probably figured out, here at the Horsepower Monster, we are all about making power in cars. Street cars, race cars, heck, even trucks. But this time we're going off the beaten path a little bit with a boat. That's because our friends at Prestige Motorsports have a really cool engine build going on, but this time it's going into a 22-foot Avanti powerboat, something similar to this, and is destined for big roost and tons of fun. So what's unique about this build is the low profile blower from the blower shop that's going on top. It's actually a marine blower, but I think it might be interesting for car guys that want that instant on blower torque and maybe even that blower whine without having to cut a hole in the hood. For marine applications, it'll also fit underneath engine covers and tight spaces in a boat. But it's unique enough that I thought we might want to see how it performs on this big block that Prestige is putting together. So we have a couple challenges with this build. One, we want to make a ton of horsepower. Obviously, we're the Horsepower Monster. That's what we do. Two, we need to do it on pump gas because boat docks are notorious for having poor quality gas in their pumps. So 93 octane is the max. And three, the setup needs to be dead nuts reliable because nobody wants to be out in the ocean when the engine knocks off. So the best way to do that is to start with lots of cubic inches, 540 in fact for our build. And we're going to do that with one of World Products Merlin IV cast iron blocks. The Merlin block adds additional strength versus a stock block with thicker main webs and cylinder bores. This block has been ordered up with a standard 9/800 inch deck height to work with the blower intake manifold. It also uses standard big block size 842 thousandths inch lifter bores and a 2-inch 120 thousandths cam journal. To accept lots of stroke, World Products already notches the bottom of the cylinder bores to make for plenty of clearance as the big end of the connecting rods swing by. The main bearings are King XPs, which the guys at Prestige try to use in all of their high performance builds. They're installed in the bearing saddles as well as the billet steel main caps, and then short block specialist Cody McCleary checks to ensure that the bearing clearances for both the mains and rod journals are exactly where they need to be. The crank gets one final cleaning, the bearings get coated with assembly lube, and then the crank is ready to be lowered into place. This is a forged crank from Eagle with a long, but not extreme, 4 1/4 inch stroke. Then Cody adds more assembly lube to the top of the journals and threads in the ARP main studs. They are always removed after machining so that there's no chance that the delicate crank journals will get scratched on assembly. Then once the crank is in place and the mains are tapped into the block's registers, the main caps can be torqued to a healthy 100 foot-pounds. The 3 center caps use splayed outer fasteners to help tie the block together. Because they're on an angle, those outers use bolts instead of studs. But they're the same size, so they also get a hundo on the torque wrench. Now we're ready for the rotating assembly. The pistons are custom slugs from JE Pistons. These forgings are 4.5 inches in diameter with an 290 thousandths compression height. That short height means the wrist pin bore intrudes into the oil ring land, so we'll run an oil ring support rail to take care of that. In addition to the 24-degree intake valve pocket, JE has also cut a 14.9 cc dish in the top of each piston to help concentrate the air-fuel charge and help keep the compression down a tick. These aren't the lightest big block pistons ever at 583 grams each, but they aren't exactly heavyweights either. Connecting the JE pistons to the Eagle crank will be a set of Eagle connecting rods. These H-beam forgings are 6 inches 385 thousandths long from center to center. Cody assembles the pistons onto the connecting rods and secures the 990 thousandths of an inch diameter wrist pins with a set of wire locks. Then he moves on to installing the piston rings, which are pretty interesting here. The top ring in this set has a relatively new feature called a PVD coating. PVD stands for physical vapor deposition, and it's a process of applying a hard coating that can be any of a number of different substances. JE specifically uses a coating that gives the ring a sort of a copper goldish look like you can see here. But what's important here is the PVD coating is both harder and smoother than traditional gas nitriding alone, which is a common treatment for performance piston rings. So we should see reduced friction with the cylinder wall, better wear resistance, and reduced chances of scuffing a cylinder. Good stuff all around. Once that's done, Cody can stuff each assembly into their respective cylinder bore. The big ends are secured with ARP cap screws, torqued to 75 foot-pounds with moly lube on the threads. Here you can see the strategic notches World Products puts into its Merlin block to gain clearance for stroker projects. For a camshaft, Prestige worked with Comp Cams to spec out a hydraulic roller with 256 degrees of duration for the intake valves at 50 thousandths tappet lift and 268 for the exhaust. It has a 111 degree intake centerline and 116 degrees of lobe separation. Lobe lift is 388 thousandths for both the intakes and exhausts. So with 1.7 ratio rocker arms, gross valve lift will be 659 thousandths of an inch. You may notice that the cam is going in pretty dry. Because the Merlin block allows access from the lifter valley, engine assembler Larry Broker slides the cam almost all the way in, then carefully paints all the cam journals and lobes with assembly lube using a small brush. Once that's done, the cam is carefully slid the rest of the way home. Then the cam retainer plate and the timing set can be installed so Broker can degree the cam and confirm all the valve timing events are correct. The oil pump is a Melling high volume unit, but the pickup may look a little bit different than usual. That's because it's from Hardin Marine, a company that is very popular with offshore racers, but not very well known among the street performance crowd. It does have a very robust brace welded on, which you can see, and I like. Also, Larry torques the oil pump mounting bolt to 55 pounds with a drop of Loctite on the threads. And here's a look at the 14-quart pan from Hardin Marine. It's all TIG welded at the seams, and at first glance looks pretty quality. On the interior, it also has a small windage tray to help reduce the chances of oil splashing back up on the crankshaft. It's also plenty deep to handle practically any realistic stroker combo. For installation, Broker uses a one-piece oil pan gasket from Felpro. If you haven't used one of these in your builds, I definitely recommend them. They have a steel core to prevent splitting if you over-torque them, and they do an excellent job of preventing those annoying oil leaks that are so difficult to eliminate when you're using old-school cork gaskets. The Hardin Marine Pan also includes some of the beefiest oil pan support rails I've ever seen. Broker installs the Woodruff keys on the snout of the crank. Since we'll be spinning up a blower, which can have a significant amount of resistance, Prestige had dual keys cut into the crank 180 degrees from each other. Over that goes the SFI certified lightweight aluminum damper from Innovators West. Then, all the pulleys for the front drive accessories, as well as the blower belt, will get bolted to that. I already mentioned that we're going with a hydraulic valve train. The lifters are hydraulic rollers from Johnson. They have a cold forged steel body that's been heat treated for wear resistance and quality needle bearings on the roller for excellent durability. Broker applies a healthy coating of assembly lube to all the lifter bores before dropping the lifters in. Interestingly, the lifters aren't soaked in oil before installation. Instead, Prestige does an extensive pressurized pre-lubing process of the entire engine on the dyno just before first fire up. They believe this better ensures that critical motor oil will be exactly where it needs to be when the engine is lit up for the first time. Then, to ensure that the rollers always stay in line with the rotation of the cam's lifter, Broker installs these dog bones that slot over the flats on each side of the lifters. If the lifter is allowed to rotate in the bore, it'll quickly wipe out both the lifter and the cam lobe. To keep the dog bones from popping off, Broker installs this piece of formed sheet metal, commonly called a spider, in the lifter valley, and the 8 arms of the spider, get it, press down on the center of each dog bone. This stock style system is a good solution if you don't want or need to get into the expense of tie bar lifters. And now let's move on over to the cylinder heads. Like many performance-oriented aftermarket big block heads these days, these rectangular port heads from AFR have the valves canted at 24 degrees versus the stock 26. The chambers are CNC cut with 121 cc's worth of volume. You can see it's not exactly the smoothest CNC work in the combustion chamber, but these heads do an excellent job of maximizing performance while managing costs. Otherwise, the intake ports are sized at 325 cc's, and AFR says that at 500 thousandths lift, these heads flow 346 CFMs through the intake ports and 262 through the exhaust. Not bad, especially considering the ports are left as cast to save a little money. Because we'll be creating extra heat in the combustion chambers thanks to the blower, Larry Broker swaps out the included steel exhaust for a set of Inconel Extreme Duty valves from Manley. Inconel is much more resistant to extreme heat temps than stainless steel, so they'll definitely be useful here. The valves are sized at 2 inches 300 thousandths for the intakes and 1 inch 880 thousandths for the exhaust, both with an 11/32 inch valve stem. Prestige also swapped out the included valve springs to a set they felt would be a better fit for the hydraulic valve train and the load profile on the cams. Owen are going a set of double nested valve springs with a 1 inch 950 thousandths installed height. With the cam profile, they will have a seat pressure of approximately 150 pounds and 450 over the nose. And then, once everything is finally assembled, Larry CCs the combustion chambers one last time to make sure he knows exactly what he's working with. We found the chamber volume is now closer to 119 than the advertised 121 cc's, which can probably be ascribed to the exhaust valve swap. Regardless, that means the final compression ratio will be 8.6 to 1. Now that's nothing extreme by modern standards, but remember, this build is for both fun and dependability. This engine should be able to make plenty of power without pushing the limits. With all that done, Larry lays a pair of Cometic MLS head gaskets onto the deck of the block and readies the cylinder heads for installation. This setup uses extra fasteners to help hold the heads down and prevent a blown head gasket under boost. 2 studs have to be threaded onto the deck of the heads first and then slot into the block, and then the rest of the head bolts can be added. Normally, Prestige likes to use head studs in boosted builds whenever possible, but for this application, the engine will wind up in a confined boat hull. Head bolts will make it easier to remove the cylinder heads in a tight space if necessary, at least compared to head studs where the heads have to be lifted all the way past the end of the studs. And here's a better look at the valve springs I was telling you about. They have the same diameter as the original springs that were supplied with the cylinder head, so we were able to reuse the original retainers. Also, from this overhead shot, you can see the multi-angle valve placement, which helps make the big block such a great performer. Anyhow, the head bolts are threaded in place and tightened to 70 foot-pounds in 3 stages to properly stretch each bolt. The 2 studs extending from the cylinder heads are tightened to 45 foot-pounds. You may notice that the bolt kit is actually for a dart block and not the World Products Merlin. That's why those big steel shims are there. Unfortunately, the real world got in the way for this build. This was shot during the pandemic when engine builders were in a constant struggle just to get parts. The underhead bolt kit for the Merlin block simply wasn't available, so Broker made it work. Next up come the 7/16 inch rocker studs and adjustable pushrod guides. The pushrods are 7 inches 800 thousandths long for the intakes and 8 inches 650 thousandths for the exhausts. Both are 3/8 of an inch in diameter with an 80 thousandths wall thickness. It's that polyangle valve design that makes the length so different. Larry starts by roughing in the guides, snugging down the rocker studs that hold them in place, but not making them really tight yet. Then he drops a rocker arm into place and carefully adjusts each side of the guide until it's perfect. With that done, he tightens the fastener securing the two halves of the guides and then cinches down each rocker stud to 70 foot-pounds. And then the valve train is capped off with a set of Prestige Motorsports own aluminum roller rockers. These have a 1.7 to 1 ratio, and as I mentioned earlier, will provide a valve lift of 659 thousandths of an inch. Since the valve train is hydraulic, setting the lash is simple. Larry just tightens the poly locks while spinning each push rod until he feels all the lash is taken up, and then he gives the adjuster an additional quarter turn before locking the entire assembly down. Then he moves on to the next one. Now, finally, we can begin the process of the blower install. A thin coat of ultra gray silicone on the intake gaskets helps eliminate the possibility of a leak down the road. Larry also seals the china rails with a thick bead of ultra gray. The intake manifold is a casting from the blower shop, also known as TBS for short, specifically for their 250 size blower. Everything from here on up is going to be great looking polished aluminum. The mating surface between the intake manifold and the blower itself can be sealed by just an O-ring. And here is the TBS 250 size blower. It's based around a popular Mercury marine blower design and uses the same bolt pattern, but otherwise it is much improved. The case is CNC machined from billet aluminum for greater strength over a casting. Plus, the interior is hard anodized to help limit wear as the billet extruded two-lobe rotors spin by. The rotors also have Teflon strips to help generate a better seal and improve boost. As you can see, the blower case is low profile, just over 6.5 inches tall. In fact, the case can accept a single or dual carb setups, but for this application, we'll be keeping it simple with just a single 950 CFM carb. The valve covers are another unique area of this build. First go on these CNC milled bases. Then Larry installs O-rings on the tops and pops them in place. The polished aluminum tops to the valve covers are held to the bases with just 2 wing nuts. If you're a boater, you may have seen these before, but I haven't. It turns out that marine exhausts turn up instead of down and run very close to the sides of the cylinder heads. So this style of valve cover makes it possible to get the valve covers off and access to the rocker arms while the exhaust manifolds are still in place. Here's a shot of when we mocked up the exhaust manifold just to make sure everything fits. Now you can see what I'm talking about. The valve covers, incidentally, are also from Hardin Marine. Larry installs the breathers and the oil fill caps, which are also high and tight to the inside of the valve covers to keep them away from the exhausts. Finally, we're getting close to wrapping things up here. Larry turns his attention to the ignition, beginning by setting the spark plug gaps to 18 thousandths of an inch. The distributor chosen is an MSD Pro Billet unit with a magnetic trigger. You can't see it here, but an MSD blaster coil will be providing the juice. At this point, Larry had to spend a couple hours on a lathe making spacers to get everything to fit, and you didn't want to sit through all that. So here's the completed front drive setup. That's the power steering pump on the upper left, the alternator on the lower left, and the marine equivalent of a water pump on the passenger side. They're all spun up on V-drive belts, but the water pump right now has no belt because it won't be used on the dyno to move water through the engine. The blower, however, is spun by an extra wide serpentine belt. This setup requires more belt tension to prevent slippage versus a traditional cog belt, so the tensioner is built into the snout and pressed by a very big and very stiff wire spring. So that's pretty much it for the build. Let's see how it actually performs on the dyno. carburetor is a 4150 size, 950 CFM unit that the boat owner had and plans to use. You'll notice that we're also using headers instead of the marine exhaust I showed you earlier, just because it wouldn't work on the Dyno. After a break-in session, we were ready to start making some steam. Ignition control is handled by an MSD 6 BTM boost controller that effectively retarded the initial timing 1 degree per pound of boost as the pressure levels ramp up. We also found the carb needed a few jet changes to get the air-fuel mixture into a healthy and safe level that also made best power. That was right around a 12.5 to 1 air-fuel ratio. So it's time to let her rip. We made our pulls from 3,400 to 5,900 RPM. The peaks were 706.4 foot-pounds of torque at 4,400 RPM and 704 horsepower at 5,800. But best of all was the power made all the way across the range. The averages were 684.5 foot-pounds of torque and 604 horsepower. That's from 3,400 all the way to almost 6. And remember, that's also all on pump gas with about 7.5 pounds of boost. Remember, boats aren't like cars. Spinning the engine up high in the RPM range isn't something that boaters ever really do. Normally, marine engines are parked at one spot in the RPM range, probably somewhere between 5,500 and 5,800 RPM, and left there for potentially hours on end as they're blasting across a body of water. That requires an entirely different beast, and that's exactly what we have sitting on the Dyno right here. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check the others we have in our roster, and we'll see you next time for another great build.